Turncoats, with its wildly dissimilar player counts of 2, 3, 4, and 5, sits in a weird design space. It's a reduction, right, of chiefly one genre, area control, but it pulls on the strands of many different design ideas to simmer down into a game that is snappy, smart, and timeless. Operating in similar spaces to The King is Dead, War of Whispers, and if you want to really stretch the boiling down here, Pax Pamir, Turncoats has you once again not playing a general leading a faction into battle, but rather the political movers and shakers behind the scenes attempting to get their ducks in a row. Why? Well, Turncoats doesn't tell you. It doesn't need to tell you. You understand how this works, and you know you want to be betting on the winning horse when whatever this conflict is ends. With this goal in mind, you'll take a look at the mostly randomized board and take stock of who is winning. If one colour has more stones in an area, they control it, and more areas controlled means closer to winning the game. Ties are broken first by control of this axe space, and secondly by this flag space. Disclaimer here, Turncoats has so many tiebreakers. If you're not a fan of the idea of seeing a tie, then breaking it in one place and then maybe having to break it in another place all the time for every single region on this board, then buddy, you should not even look at this game anymore. You shouldn't buy Turncoats. But if you don't mind a tiebreaker, you should stick around. You'll then look at your stones, 8 of them in your hand, drawn randomly from the bag at the start of the game, and these stones show your allegiance to any given faction, your vested interest in them succeeding. Red seems to be in the lead, and you've got 4 red stones, meaning you've essentially got 4 points compared to your friend's measly 2 or none. They're hoping that blue is going to make a steady ascent to the throne, and you are going to try and stop them. Or maybe you could join them instead. So that's the lay of the land. How do you terraform it? How do you engage with this political landscape? Turncoats has just 4 different actions. They're all meaningful, different, and meaningfully different, but you'll notice a common theme between them. Recruiting lets you take a stone from your hand and place it on the board, adding to a faction's presence in a region, but ultimately diminishing your own control of that faction. Moving has you put a stone on the flag space to move any number of that colour of stones from one space to an adjacent space. Attacking works similarly. Placing a stone on the axe will remove 1 other stone for every stone of the colour placed in a region where they're present. Negotiating is the last action. You take a stone from the bag, and then put another stone back in, showing it to everyone else. So no action lets you gain stones. The best you can do is tread water in a swimming pool made of custard, and everything else you do ties dumbbells to your ankles. Even negotiating, the action that doesn't require you to spend anything, pushes the end of the game closer. If everyone negotiates in a row, you stop playing, you work out who wins. The most stones of the winning faction takes the game, with ties broken by who has the fewest stones of the other losing factions. I warned you about the tiebreakers. I've kept this video kind of pared back on the jokes and goofs and gags because I do want to let the simple genius of Turncoats shimmer. What The King is Dead is to Pax Pamir, Turncoats is to The King is Dead. That's not a comment on the quality of any of those games, or indeed their actual chronological lineage, but it is something magical to have a game so simple and raw that the information you gain throughout is never uninteresting. Having everything so clean is the equivalent of when you move house and you take all the furniture out of a room and you see how spacious and echoey everything is, you notice those weird little architectural quirks you'd missed while you were busy living in it. This space and the design lets you mentally keep track of who has roughly what stones. It lets you read intentions a little more clearly than you would otherwise. It lets you deduce the ballpark stats on what faction makes up the population of that cursed little bag. It's a magic trick used often by Reiner Knizia, ripping everything superfluous from the design until you're left with a core consideration that you might think about more than you would otherwise if it were covered in mechanics. But also, maybe more interestingly, allows players to flesh out the game with their own perspectives. It wasn't until our 3rd or 4th game that people began realizing they could very much negotiate. making vague allusions to what was in their hand for a competitive edge, or instead having one player making moves directly opposed to their interests for the entire game as one long, drawn-out bluff. There's rules between the rules, I guess. There's bountiful, unacknowledged directions you can take this puzzle. A game this simple can sometimes be a weird amphitheatre for personality, just as much something like a Feast for Odin can be, where you spec hard into horses or something. You get to be the horse guy. Here it's a tad more subtle. And when those personal strategies pay off, or for the case of the other wonderful players in the game, do not, you have quite a stunning reveal. When everyone negotiates, the winner is obvious. Stones are dispensed from clammy palms in single, understandable digits. Like the reveal in Tigris and Euphrates, it's often a low winning score. Like everything else in Turncoats, it's simple, violent, and snappy. And even more intriguing, the scores in games can vary substantially, from a winning score of 3 or 4 stones from quiet players, down to games where everyone just has 1 stone. I've even seen people bank on none, in the hopes that they'll have the fewest of the losing factions and nobody else is in a position to win. It didn't work. Turncoats' production quirk here is that the board is a bag. It's also cloth, it's also handmade, it's also gorgeous, and it's also quite cheap considering all of these factors. Milda Matilda Games, the sole producer of this object, and please be careful if you order one of these games, she's using Google Forms to process orders for God's sake, clearly has an interest in ancient games, going so far as to dub them as good versions of modern games. This game is Matilda making an ancient game, in its production and in its stylings, and it works. It's a game you unspool on any surface for any number of people to grasp and maybe be dazzled by. I really think Turncoats is very strong, but it certainly isn't for everyone. The lack of theme and level of abstraction can certainly be off-putting, and you really do have to crunch a lot of tiebreakers for things to even begin to make sense on a mechanical level, and sometimes that task can be frequent and irritating enough for some people that they just switch off the game that they're actually being presented with. It's an abstraction, but applied to a genre that's normally punchy and thematic. When you think of area control, you don't think necessarily of games that look like this. And this combination certainly won't be everyone's cup of tea. But circling back to the idea of this object being ancient, the cloth board, the simplicity, the choice of materials, and the abstraction involved, it simmers down into something that feels almost ritualistic, a game that's played in mostly contemplative, tense silence, that allows different brains to bash against each other in weird and interesting ways. It is simply a delight.